Hey Mom, my grandpa's 90th birthday is coming up, and I was wondering if you could actually tell me what was going on when he was a child and growing up, and the times and the lives that he lived and the stories that he could tell us.
That sounds good. Why don't I just tell you the whole story? Well, in 1923, on September 11th, he was born in Seattle, Washington, to Carl and Wilma Nelson. My grandpa Carl was a World War I vet before he settled in San Francisco and worked for the Buick Company. And my grandma Wilma was a daughter of Ohio homesteaders who later made their way to San Francisco where they met. On the day that your grandpa was born, the world's biggest blimp flew over the New York's tallest skyscraper, the Woolworth Building, I'm sure just to celebrate his birth. And in that same month, the Milky Way candy bar was introduced, and it was very successful and still very popular today, just like him. That same year, Betty Page, the queen of pinups, and Alan Shepard, the first American in space who later walked on the moon, and Charlton Heston were born. But to me, my dad's life is more beautiful than Betty's, more adventurous than Alan's, and compared to that Mr. Heston, his life is what they used to say. It was the bee's knees or the cat's pajamas. Also that same year, the first Time magazine hit the stands, probably to announce my dad's birth. The first portable radio was developed, probably to announce his birth too. The first movie with sound was played, probably to announce his birth. A new company called Disney was formed, probably to make movies about him. And then Yankee Stadium opened for its first baseball game. Governors, generals, politicians, and baseball officials were there to celebrate, and I'm sure also to celebrate my dad. When he was born, I read that a loaf of bread was 5 cents, a new Chevy Roadster, $480, a new home, $8,000. But being here today to share the story with you is priceless. Soon after he was born, he moved to San Francisco. It was the roaring 20s and life was good. They had a very nice apartment in the city, a new car, and a mountain cabin not far from Santa Cruz. When my dad was a child, he was showered with attention and love from his parents and all his aunts. He was an only child. And when he was 10, things changed. Prohibition ended, and then that's when they began to struggle with the Great Depression. His dad lost his nice job, and they had to sell their summer home. And with the money, they bought a ranch, fruit trees, 2,000 chickens, and some rabbits. They were going to try to make a living selling eggs, but they didn't do so well, but they did survive. But he was young enough, and I'm sure he didn't feel the pressures that his parents did. In his teens, things got better, and he settled back in San Francisco with his mom, where they both worked hard to make ends meet. At one point, my grandma worked 3 jobs at the same time, and he was a latchkey kid before latchkey kids were latchkey kids. Going to school, coming home to an empty apartment, cooking for himself, and working part-time after-school jobs. But it wasn't always bad. He told me that when he was 14, he got to walk across the Golden Gate Bridge on its grand opening day. He still had time for sports and friends and probably some girlfriends. I don't really know about that.
Well, that's pretty interesting. It seems like despite the times that he was able to see some great things and live through some great adventures.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you can tell me a little bit more about his adolescence, 17, 18 years old, becoming a man and growing up and going into the world.
Sure. I don't know if you're going to believe this, but apparently he was a bit of a rebel. He joined the National Guard when he was only 17, and because of that, he was discharged so he could go back and finish high school. But as soon as he finished high school, he joined the service. He became a soldier. And that was the same year that our country entered World War II. Well, during that time, he got to travel the world. He trained a lot of people and held some very important positions. And he even got to meet some very famous people. But again, one of his biggest regrets is that he didn't get to go to college. But I know he was exactly where he was meant to be. He didn't need college anyway. I mean, he knows more than anybody else. He's a walking encyclopedia.
Oh, so it sounds like he had an interesting start to his manhood with the service.
Right.
Okay, well, it seems like he had a pretty interesting life up until his first retirement. So why don't you tell me a little bit after that?
Well, if he hadn't joined the service, he never would have met my mother. I mean, they had a really good marriage. They fell in love and spent over 50 years together, and I wouldn't be here telling you the story if he hadn't met her. They spent many happy years together before I came along, just the two of them. They did a lot of camping and traveling and skiing together. And then I was born in 1960 when he was 37, and that was 6 years before he retired from the Air Force. I was his only child, and like him, I was showered with a lot of attention and love from him and my mom. My parents were my best friends and favorite playmates. Even though he worked all day doing whatever important things he was doing out there, he always came home and had time for me. We used to play cards and board games, and I still remember when he taught me how to tie my shoelaces on my little red sneakers. We had a lot of fun together when I was young, and I traveled with him throughout my whole life until I moved out.
Well, it seems like when you came onto the scene, he was still just as active and busy, and he drug you right into the lifestyle of traveling and good family ties. Okay, well, what happened after that?
Well, after he retired from the Air Force, we moved to Camp Springs, Maryland, where Andrews Air Force Base is located. It's about 5 miles outside of the Washington, D.C. line. And my dad went to work for the Defense Department. So during that time, we had the Airstream trailer, and he took us camping in it a lot. When we were on our road trips, I was always his co-pilot. He'd have me helping him read the maps. He used to really get a kick out of that because he was a photo interpreter, and he had to read maps for his job. And he also let me pick a lot of the places that we camped at. I had this book, and I would always find a place that had a swimming pool. And then after he parked the trailer, he'd always come swimming with me. And then I remember one summer we took a 3-week trip where we went through the whole country. I didn't know it until later on that that wasn't really camping. I mean, in that Airstream we had electricity, hot water, air condition, color TV, stove, refrigerator, and a bathroom. And every winter he took us away to either Florida or the Caribbean. So when we weren't traveling, him and my mom used to spend a lot of time in the garden. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, literally down the street from all the protests against the establishment and all the changing values and women's lib was going on. And I'm sure my dad, he was part of the greatest generation, was scowling at that whole hippie movement. I know it wasn't easy for him to raise me, his teenage daughter, in that climate. But he didn't have to worry about that much longer. He was still able to infuse in me the value of honest and hard work. During those years, Dad provided my mom and me with a stable life, and after I was done being crazy, he got back to the business of enjoying his life again.
Well, it sounds like a pretty interesting time.
Okay, well, then in 1979, when he was 56, he retired for good. And he went back west with my mom, and they built their own home in Washington State. And he told everybody that this is where he was going to live the rest of his life. But retirement for him meant a new hobby of making jewelry. He started a jewelry appraisal business. He was tutoring 5th graders, and he became very active in the local government. He was written a lot about in the local newspapers, and every time he would send me a letter, he would include another article or 2 or 3 that mentioned him. I remember one of the quotes about him said that he never stood in one place long enough for the grass to grow under his feet. And then he also became a travel agent and tour guide. And in that position, they took some more really amazing trips, and some of their friends joined him on some of those. Well, when he wasn't on a trip, he loved to garden. And, my mom did too, and they grew more vegetables and fruit than anyone. A lot of the food they grew went to the local food bank. Everything was organic, and they composted before that was even a cool thing to do. I didn't understand why they spent all that time doing all that work when all they could have done was just gone to the store and buy the food. But now, how I wish I could eat that fresh produce again every day like that. My dad used to always tell me that I didn't understand how good my life was, and I really didn't, but now I get it.
Well, that's all very exciting, but let's get to the important facts. What about me?
Well, when my dad was 61, you were born. And when you were born, my mom planted a plum tree in the garden just to honor your birth. And after that, they got in their trailer and they took a trip across country just to pay us a visit, or pay you a visit.
Oh, okay, this story is actually starting to sound familiar. I'll go ahead and take it from here. I remember they would come out, and my grandfather always made time so the two of us could hang out, just boys. And now that I look back, I can see that I'm a spitting image of my grandfather Kenney. Little Kenney and little Joel. Two peas in a pod. Throughout the years, my grandfather taught me many things, swimming, riding bikes, and we also took some special trips. I remember in space camp, he was in there doing the flight simulators and all the different NASA training with me. He also paid for me to go to some very nice camps, Catalina in the summers, and some different experiences, which I could have never afforded. These trips and the time that we spent together made a very special impact for my grandfather. As I grew up, I realized that I loved the same things that he did when he was young. Camping, hanging out in the snow, being in the outdoors.
You know, I look back and I see a lot of his qualities in you. I mean, you're both hard workers, you're both high achievers, you're reliable, practical, stable. Dad always tells me what a good job I did of raising you, but that's not true. It's actually his attributes that have been carried down to you.
At this point, my grandparents were tired of being snowbirds. Winter house, summer house, back and forth between the two. They wanted one permanent residence where they could spend 12 months out of the year. This residence happened to be Vista, North County, San Diego. 12 months out of the year, it was sunshine and a cool ocean breeze. And at that point, Grandpa Kenney said those famous words, "This will be the last house that I spend the rest of my days in." Well, if you know Kenney, you know that that's definitely not the end of the story. Within a few years, he had gotten tired of it, sold the house, and moved to Riverside. He was just a few streets away from myself and my mother and the rest of the family. It was really great because we could pop in any day of the week with less than a 5-minute drive for dinner. And he had said those same words, "This is the last house. I will spend the rest of my days here." But once again, we know better than that. Within 2 years, the house was sold, and his new residence, which is where he currently lives, up in Camarillo, Leisure Village, is what he was calling home. So at that point, he continued to travel. He was taking trips all across the globe, and he was letting the family enjoy and share those memories with them. Meeting new people, new faces, new cultures, and most importantly, new memories for the newer generations that he had created. Just 2 years ago, I had the honor of going with him and some of his friends from the village back to Washington to see some of the World War II monuments and museums that he was a part of, being the greatest generation. It was a great opportunity we got to share together, and one that I'll remember for the rest of my life and be able to tell the story to all of my children. And if you know Kenney, you know he wasn't done there. He's always got to stay active, so he also started taking flying lessons so that he could become a pilot. And he was the oldest pilot at the Camarillo Airport. We even had the opportunity to go on a flight with him. And let me mention, it was one of the scariest flights. I wish I had packed a parachute. Even though my grandmother is no longer at his side, he still has a great deal of new friends and a very special companion, May, who is now one of his traveling buddies. I see God continuing to bless his life with the people who surround him. We're all very lucky to have these times. It's great for him to be able to spend time with my family now and experience holidays and see the future generations coming up. Just last year, he was able to come to my wedding, his only grandson's wedding, and he was very excited and everyone was glad to see him there. So now, we wonder what's next for Kenney. Well, we know it's not going to be sitting at home watching TV. He's going to be out there doing something new and exciting. Oh, look, there he goes, starting off on his newest adventure. I wonder what it will be.